Kapil Kumar's. And he said finally one David Morrow saved the day, and there was one, there was funny. One, I guess what you might call a white American male. So this is a remarkable shift, And what this means is that the transformation of Asia is real. This is not a ephemeral thing. This is actually a fundamental shift of world history, and the mastery of science and technology in some ways confirms it.
Two other figures I want to cite from your book. Asia's share of global high-tech exports rose from 7% in 1980 to 25% in 2001, while the U.S. share went from 31 to 18%. And then from 1983 to 2003, students from four Asian countries, China, Taiwan, India, and South Korea, own more than 50% of the science and engineering doctoral degrees awarded in the United States. So Tom Friedman wasn't seeing a mirage. You have a wonderful way of expressing this change. You talk about the march to modernity and how this affected the poor on the one hand, but then the other thing, you have a beautiful turn of phrase here, introducing gifted people to the global society, namely the untapped mental resources that are in Asia and were never tapped because of the poverty.
Yeah, well, I must say I'm amazed how well you've read the book.
Yeah.
Well, and you have highlighted two very critical points in the book. One, the phrase march to modernity, and I hope that phrase march to modernity becomes used more and more often in the contemporary discourse, because it is this march to modernity that is making the world a safer place. It began, as you know, with Japan, the first Asian country to succeed. From Japan, it went to the Four Tigers. From the Four Tigers, it went to Southeast Asia. And then when, as I say in the book, when the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping looks all around the borders of China and says, hey, why is every economy around China doing better than China? And why not China? So he switches the systems. So the march to modernity enters China. And then when China takes off, India says, come on, we are as good as China. We can do it too. So now India is also taking off. And this brings me to the really important piece of good news, okay? This march to modernity is now about to enter the Islamic world. Now, can you imagine an Islamic world where you have the elites and the middle class saying, our vision is to be like China and India. We want to have successful, growing, modernizing economies. That's where we want to go. And if the Islamic population begins to create very large middle class, it means a much safer world for all of us, because they too become responsible stakeholders, And the second point you mentioned is, I think, an equally important one. When people ask me, if I had to give a very simple explanation of why Asia is taking off now, I say the simplest way to understand it is this. Asia had hundreds of millions of brains, always. But they were never used, They were, in Asia, because of traditional Asian culture, birth was destiny. If you were born in the untouchable caste in India, you could never leave the untouchable caste. So can you imagine millions of brains being wasted? But in India today, you can have someone who grew up in an untouchable family, suffered a terrible childhood, being excluded, being kept aside from his classmates in class, and then that same person could go on, do well in school, get a PhD at Columbia University, and become the chief economist of the Reserve Bank of India. His name is Narendra Yadav. And the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, says that this is an enormous silent revolution taking place in India. And all the brains like Narendra Yadav's that were wasted for centuries are now emerging and creating a tremendous explosion of gifted people all over Asia.
It's interesting because toward the end of the Cold War, and as Asia began to rise, the idea was, okay, Asia, there were so many different peoples, so many ethnic divisions, so many different countries. that we were entering an era in which war would be constant or intermittent at a minimum in Asia. That didn't happen. Why not?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've noticed, as you know, in what happens in academia is that as a result of textbooks, you get recycled wisdom being sent to the students, you know. And unfortunately, most students in America and Europe keep reading the old stuff that was written about Asia, which says, and I quote this in my first book, Can Asians Think?, that Europe's past is Asia's future, which means that the Europe that used to fight each other for centuries will therefore, this is what Asian powers will do. As they rise and emerge, they will fight each other like the European powers do. And this assumes, of course, that the Asians cannot think, cannot figure out for themselves, hey, what works in the world. Indeed, but as I explained in the book, one of the 7 pillars of Western wisdom that the Asians are learning is what is called the culture of peace. And here the biggest tribute I give to the European Union is that the European Union has reached the highest level of human civilization. And by the highest level, I mean that in Europe you don't just have 0 wars between any 2 EU member states, you also have 0 prospect of war. And that's an incredible human achievement, you know? And the Asians have studied that and looked at Europe and said, hey, why can't we do it too? Why not learn from Europe? So in Asia, we have already achieved 0 wars. Indeed, for the first time in a long time, the guns are silent. There are no more interstate wars anywhere in East Asia. And so you can now proceed to the next level of trying to achieve 0 prospect of war. And from all I see in Asia, this is the trend. This is clearly the dominant trend in Asia.
And is it because of the rise of the middle class as part of this march to modernity that there isn't a constituency for war? And on what circumstances might there be?
I think, well, I give a very simple explanation, you know. I say that what you see in Asia today is that Asia has been overcome by a tidal wave of common sense. And, you know, you have more and more young Asians, you know, who can see what life is like. You mentioned YouTube, you mentioned Google, all that's prevalent in Asia. In fact, the degree of broadband penetration is higher in many Asian countries than in America or Europe. This is something very few Americans know. And so they're connected to the modern world. And if you're connected to the modern world, you really realize the futility of war. And in some ways, you know, the Iraq war, which as you know is very tragic, its biggest contribution may have been to further delegitimize war in the modern world. Because the whole world could see that the richest and the most powerful country in the world couldn't invade and occupy a country of 20 million people, very poor country. It shows how difficult war is today. And so it's clear that, of course, the Asian countries will continue to have defense budgets, will continue to have military expenditures, and that, as you know, is prudent, but they're going to try and avoid war.
You look at China as kind of a model in the way it's formulated a foreign policy that has furthered developments in